They kept the lights on the whole time, as if brightness could bargain with sleep. In the fall of 1966, Whitlo, Kansas, was a two-street town with a water tower that leaned like it was listening. On a Tuesday, no one remembered preparing for 16-year-old Laya Merritt, put her head down on a geometry workbook, and did not get back up. Her mother found her an hour later, cheek warm against the paper, pencil still in her hand, as if her mind had stepped out for air and forgotten the door. The doctor pinched her nail bed, shined a penlight, tapped her ankle. Lila breathed, swallowed, and blinked on cue, just not at anything in front of her. "It's a deep sleep," he told her parents, choosing words like someone arranging flowers for the wrong funeral. "It'll break any hour." By sunrise, the town had gathered its worry into a casserole train and a prayer chain. By Friday, the radio started carrying it. On Sunday, the pastor said, "Sometimes God speaks through silence." A week later, he said, "Sometimes silence is just a test of yours." Out on County Road 5, the Merritt house turned into a second kind of church, windows open to airflow, curtains motionless, a girl sleeping in a bed her body still owned, but her life didn't. They tried to wake her with peppermint and piano, with thunder and names, with a slap of cold cloth. She slept through it all, and something in Whitlo learned to equalize around her, like how pond water stills after you pull your hand out. People came like weather, women from the PTA, men from the grain co-op, a boy who claimed he could whistle birds out of trees and wanted to try with dreams. Someone suggested an alarm clock. Someone else suggested a priest. Her father suggested nobody suggest anything in his house again, and then apologized, wiping his face with both hands like he was trying to clean his thoughts. They set up a rota, 3-hour shifts in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and starch, so Lila would never be alone with whatever had taken her. At night, you could hear the shift change in the gravel, car doors, murmurs, a polite cough, the way community sounds when it's pretending not to be scared. On day 8, Mrs. Fancher laid a transistor radio on the nightstand, the cheap kind with a dial that could find God or weather, depending on how you held it. She tuned past the Wichita preacher, past ball scores, past cattle prices, to a seam of static that wasn't empty. Lila's breathing adjusted half a beat, as if the silence on that frequency had invited hers to keep time. The needle quivered without a hand. "Interference," said the doctor when told about it, as if the right word could sand the edge off the wrong experience. But that night, Whitlo heard the sirens from 2 towns over. Grain elevator fire, collapsed ladder, a man they all knew by his hands, and the radio by Lila shifted a breath earlier, catching a phantom tone right before the alarms did. "Coincidence," said the doctor. The priest said, "Mystery." The father said nothing at all. By the second week, Whitlo had decided what Lila meant. The doctor kept records with the mercy of a metronome. Temperature, pupil response, REM intervals, like tides you could chart on a calendar if the moon respected Kansas. The pastor kept vigil with a pocket New Testament and the kind of smile that bruises at the corners. Lila's mother kept the house moving, laundry, starch, windows, because stillness was a dare. Her father started a tape, spools turning, red eye lit, his voice listing the hour, the room, the breathing. Wednesday, 0142, wind out of the south. Lila is, he never said asleep. He said, here. It was short, 3 clicks like someone practicing how to knock, and then a tone that didn't belong to the radio or the room. When he played it for the doctor, The man put on his glasses and took them off again. Transformer noise, he offered. For the pastor, opposition. For her mother, hush. They turned off the tape, and the house felt immediately smaller, as if the recorder had been bulking the walls out with attention. Out on the porch, the father lit a cigarette he'd sworn off a decade ago and counted the crickets to prove the world still added up to the same number. Down the road, a storm was learning its lines. The tornado didn't touch Whitlo. That would have been too easy to blame. It came through Dalton County at 2:47 a.m., keeping its manners until it didn't, laying into a row of barns with the slow confidence of a man counting bills. The Whitlo siren, rusted white, mounted on a pole that leaned like the tower, failed to trip. But the little radio on Lila's nightstand found the note first, a sub-breath in the static, and tilted the house toward it. In the hallway, the picture frames clicked against the wall like teeth. Lila's father sat up on the cot and listened with his whole face. At 2:47, her diaphragm hit a long inhale and held, the way people do when they're deciding whether to speak or choke. 30 miles away, a barn roof became a frisbee. 12 minutes later, Whitlo's phones lit with other people's grief. The town learned to speak past a mouthful of guilt. Thank God it missed us. God help the ones that didn't. The doctor called it sympathetic arousal. The pastor called it a burden share. By breakfast, the father had found a new habit, stepping outside to see if the sky knew he was watching. He swore the contrails leaned toward the house like they were consulting it about which direction to take. Her mother kept setting an extra plate at the table and then removing it, as if etiquette applied to absence. Out beyond the last mailbox, the corn made its old promise. Next season, better. Lila slept. The radio dial trembled at the seam between two stations as though keeping balance between them was part of the job. He introduced himself as Ernest Vail, University of Kansas, neurology, sleep research, portable EEG, as new as the moon landing, and twice as proud. He arrived in a Ford that looked like it had opinions about the road. The doctor didn't like him, the pastor didn't trust him, the father didn't need him, but the mother opened the door anyway because hospitality is just love with chores. Vail unpacked a briefcase that unfolded into a silver altar, electrodes like tiny cup hooks, wires thin as truth, a strip chart recorder with a mouth that clicked paper out in careful tongues. If she's in there, this will tell us how deep, he said, and the word deep made the house go colder. They'd barely stuck the last electrode when the pen jittered and traced a rhythm that wasn't heartbeat or breath. 4 long, 1 short, pause. 4 long, 1 short, pause. Artifact, Vail said, but he adjusted his glasses like the page had said his middle name. He asked for silence. The pastor obliged with a prayer so quiet it made the wallpaper lean in. The father started the tape again because if a miracle was going to happen, he wanted it to have an alibi. Then, soft as rehearsal, the radio found the same rhythm. 4 long, 1 short. Pause. Vail smiled without joy. Entrainment, he said. External signals. She's tuning to them. The pastor countered gently, or they to her. Outside, the noon train blew through the cut at Miller's farm and somehow sounded like it was coming from under the bed. The silver pen kept writing, and if you squinted, you could pretend those lines were spelling something the paper hadn't learned to read yet. For 3 days, the pen never stopped moving. Vail changed the paper roll every 8 hours. stacking the curls of graph sheets like someone collecting proof of a haunting. Each line mirrored the last, a rhythm that was too patient to be random, a pattern repeating as though the world itself were tapping its own pulse in Morse. Lila's mother stopped calling it sleep. She started calling it waiting. On the fourth morning, the rhythm broke, not stopped, just shifted. The new wave was longer, slower, like something distant answering back. Vale charted the intervals, measuring the unknown with the calm precision of a man too scared to admit it was real. Then, at 6:02 a.m., the pattern surged upward once, just as the ground under Whitlo trembled. The radio reported an earthquake 90 miles away in Oklahoma. Vale's recorder had predicted it by 7 seconds. He stared at the line on the paper and whispered, "It's resonance." The pastor said, "It's prophecy." The doctor said nothing. That night, every dog in town began to howl, and every clock stopped for exactly 7 seconds, the same number that separated the signal from the quake. Whitlo became a place where silence was an event, and the hum between seconds began to feel alive. Sleep became contagious. People in Whitlo started complaining of dreams that didn't belong to them. Long corridors with doors that never opened, a humming that followed them down hallways, and the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't their own. The doctor blamed hysteria, the pastor blamed awe, and Vale blamed himself. The first dreamer was Mrs. Fancher, the woman who'd brought the radio. She woke screaming about a windmill collapse, and 2 hours later, the hardware store's tower buckled in a sudden gust of wind. Then came the milkman, who dreamed of flooded cornfields. 3 days later, the irrigation dam cracked at its base. Soon, no one wanted to close their eyes. The town began keeping notes of its nightmares like a second census. Vale compared their sleep times to Lila's and found every dream started within minutes of her REM spikes. He wrote one word on the chart, SYNC. Lila's father tore the page out and burned it in the sink, saying some words shouldn't be given back to the dark. Still, the dreams kept coming, and every one of them ended the same way, with a sound, soft and steady, like the world breathing in. By November, Vale had stopped pretending he wasn't obsessed. He set a microphone by Lila's bed, running a direct line into his reel-to-reel machine. For hours, it captured nothing but the soft rise and fall of her breath. Then, at 3:11 a.m., a sound emerged from the static. 5 ascending tones, faint but deliberate. Vale rewound the tape again and again, convinced it was feedback, until he noticed the sequence repeated every 42 seconds, perfectly timed with her pulse. He filtered the sound through his analysis equipment and replayed it in reverse. What came through wasn't tone. It was his name, Ernest, clear as a whisper through water. He shut off the machine and sat in the dark, the smell of warm tape filling the room like ozone after lightning. The next night, he recorded again. This time, the tones changed, slower, deeper, stretching toward the lower limit of hearing. Vale pressed his ear to the speaker and heard something layered beneath, a child's laugh, faint and patient. He didn't sleep after that. When morning came, he told the Merritts nothing, but Lila's mother swore she heard humming through the walls long before the machine was turned on. On the morning of November 21st, a letter appeared in the Merritt mailbox, postmarked 3 days ahead. The envelope was unmarked, except for their address written in careful, squared handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper that read, "Stop recording before the 10th night." The postmaster swore it came in that morning's mailbag. Vale examined the paper and saw faint impressions on the back, the outline of EEG lines identical to Lila's. He said nothing, burned the letter in the sink, and kept working. The next night, the radio in the kitchen burst into tone again, but this time, the hum formed syllables, words half chewed by static. Stop, before, the 10. Then all of Whitlo went dark. Power lines failed. Clocks froze at 2:13 a.m. When the electricity returned, every house clock still read 2:13, except the Merritt's, which read 2:14. Vale marked it anyway. That morning, a telegraph operator from Topeka called the sheriff. An unsent message had appeared on their system from Whitlo at 2:14 a.m. It contained only 3 words: "She is awake." By the 10th night, no one in Whitlo slept. Vale had moved his equipment outside to test for interference. The pastor kept vigil with an open Bible, his hands trembling like a tuning fork. The mother prayed, the father did not. At exactly midnight, the hum began again, louder, deeper, resonating through walls and soil alike. The house vibrated as though something beneath it was moving. Vale shouted to cut the power, but it didn't stop. The radio dials spun on their own. Lila's body arched slightly, and her eyes opened without waking. Her pupils rolled white, the EEG machine spiking into perfect symmetry, every line matching every other line. The pen carved through the paper until it tore, still writing. Outside, the livestock turned to face the Merritt house all at once, motionless. The hum climbed in pitch, filling every corner of the house until the walls seemed to inhale. Then it stopped. Lila exhaled once, soft and deliberate, and the pen drew one straight line across the graph. When Vale tore the sheet free, he saw a single word written by accident of waveform: open. When the hum stopped, the silence that replaced it felt like pressure, as if the air itself had weight. Vale switched off the recorder, though the machine was already still. He glanced at the others. The pastor was frozen mid-prayer, his lips parted, but silent. The mother clutched Lila's hand like she was holding on to gravity. Outside, the livestock stood unmoving in the fields, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold air. The clocks around the house ticked once, then went quiet. "Is she breathing?" the mother whispered. Vale leaned close. "Yes," he said, though he wasn't sure it was true. Lila's chest rose and fell, but it was the rhythm that unsettled him. Too slow, too deliberate, like an imitation of life. When he placed his hand above her heart, he didn't feel a beat. He felt vibration. He told himself it was his imagination. That sound couldn't linger like touch. But when he looked at the paper roll in his hand, the word open seemed to pulse faintly against the page. He turned it over, searching for tricks of light, but the ink shimmered like wet oil. In the hallway, one of the mirrors cracked down the center without being touched. The sound was small but final, like a door clicking shut. Vale looked up, and for the first time in weeks, he wished the hum would start again, because whatever replaced it felt worse. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening. That night, Whitlo slept like a town that had forgotten how. The sky above the Merritt house was the color of ash. Vale stayed awake in the kitchen, surrounded by equipment that no longer worked. Every time he turned the dial on his radio, the same faint noise returned, a slow, steady thump, like something buried deep underground, knocking to be let in. At first, he thought it was heartbeat interference from the microphone, but the pattern didn't match. It wasn't human. It was slower, deliberate. He recorded 10 minutes, played it back, and froze when the waveform drew shapes instead of sound. Not letters exactly, but something that looked like handwriting without language. He shut off the machine and stepped outside. The air was still, the kind of stillness that came after explosions. From the road, he could see the Merritt house pulsing faintly, the windows breathing with a dim light that didn't belong to electricity. He thought of waking the family, but the idea of breaking that kind of silence felt like sacrilege. Instead, he whispered to no one, "What are you?" The light flickered once in response, like acknowledgement. By dawn, the glow had faded, but the soil beneath his shoes felt warm, and when he bent down to touch it, he realized it wasn't heat. It was vibration, the same rhythm that used to come from Lila's chest. Whatever had entered Whitlo was still here. It just didn't need her body anymore. By morning, news had spread that every radio in town had clicked on at midnight. Each tuned itself to static. The sheriff, tired from chasing reports that made no sense, arrived at the Merritt house just after sunrise. Vale met him on the porch, still pale, coffee untouched in his hand. "You're saying it all happened at once?" the sheriff asked. Vale nodded. "I'm saying it started here." The sheriff stepped inside, boots squeaking on the floorboards. The first thing he noticed was the air, heavy, damp, electric. "You smell that?" he muttered. The pastor crossed himself. "It's iron," Vale said. "Ozone." They found the mother sitting by Lila's bedside, her fingers stroking the girl's hair as if time could be coaxed backward through touch. "She hasn't moved," the mother whispered, "but the sheets feel like she has." Vale checked the instruments, but every needle stayed still. Then the sheriff noticed something strange on the window pane, condensation shaped like fingerprints, pressed from the outside. They wiped it clean. A minute later, it returned, 5 small ovals, forming a handprint that didn't belong to anyone in the room. "Could be a trick of air," the sheriff said, though his voice lacked conviction. He turned toward the bed, only to find Lila's eyes open again, not wide, just enough to catch the light. "She's awake!" her mother gasped. But Vale knew better. The eyes weren't focused on anyone in the room. They were staring past them, toward the wall, where the cracked mirror had begun to hum. The mirror's vibration deepened until every picture frame in the room began to rattle. Vale stepped forward, pressing his palm to the glass, and felt the same low rhythm that had haunted the recordings. It wasn't reflection anymore. It was repetition. "It's copying," he said, though he wasn't sure to whom. Behind him, the pastor began to pray louder, the mother to weep, the sheriff to shout for everyone to leave. But Lila didn't move. The light from her eyes, faint, milky, spread to the mirror like dawn crawling up the horizon. For an instant, Vale saw something staring back. Not her face, not his, but an outline made of shifting static, a human shape drawn from interference. It tilted its head, mirroring his movement with one subtle delay. Then it smiled. The glass bulged outward, as if something behind it was breathing against the surface. Vale stumbled back. "It's not showing us," he said, voice shaking. "It's showing itself." The sheriff fired once, the bullet cracking the glass into a spiderweb of fractures, but no shards fell. Instead, the cracks rearranged themselves into lines, curves, letters. The word spelled out across the web was "Listen." Then the mirror stilled, perfectly smooth again. In the reflection, no one appeared. Not Vale, not the others. Only the bed behind them, empty. The mother turned and screamed. The sheets where Lila had been were flat, untouched. All that remained was the faint indentation of a body still pressing against the mattress from somewhere very far away. That night, the hum came back, but it wasn't local anymore. Radios as far as St. Louis reported interference between midnight and 1 a.m., a low signal transmitting what engineers described as an unclassifiable waveform resembling human EEG data. Vale, now pale and sleepless, drove to the broadcasting tower outside town. The signal meter jumped before he even reached the door. Inside the control room, every dial was alive, every frequency spinning as if searching for something. The operator, shaking, said, "It's not coming from here. It's coming through here." On the main monitor, the static resolved for one impossible second into an image. A white shape resembling a face, eyes closed, mouth moving, no sound, just motion. Vale leaned closer. He could read the shape of the lips. 3 words, slow and deliberate. "Do you hear me?" Then the lights blew. The entire control room fell silent. In the reflection of the glass, Vale saw himself, but standing behind him, perfectly still, was a second reflection wearing his face. When the power came back, the figure was gone. The signal too. Only one line remained on the monitor, repeating endlessly, bright green against the dark screen, 000000000, binary for nothing, or maybe for everything that had finally learned how to speak. Within 24 hours, the hum had gone national. Weather stations reported interference across multiple frequencies, a low vibration threading between emergency channels and shortwave bands. In Topeka, a dispatcher claimed her radio whispered her own name before cutting to static. Truck drivers along Route 54 said they could feel their CB units throb like heartbeats. Vale drove home in silence, the highway unspooling in the headlights like magnetic tape. Every few miles, his radio flickered to life, catching a half-second of the hum before dying again. He tried to tune away from it, but the noise followed. It wasn't confined to frequency anymore. It existed between them. At a diner outside Hutchinson, the waitress turned up the news. Scientists in Denver had picked up a repeating pattern from the Midwest that matched human brainwave frequencies. "Could be military," the anchor said. Vale knew better. He hadn't slept in days, and when he closed his eyes at the counter, he saw graphs instead of dreams. Every waveform he'd ever recorded was converging into one perfect symmetrical line, a shape that meant balance, or maybe surrender. On the road back to Whitlo, the sky above the horizon pulsed once, faint but distinct, as though the stars were syncing to a new metronome. Vale gripped the steering wheel tighter and whispered, "She's still broadcasting." The car radio, dead for miles, came alive just long enough to echo him. "She's still broadcasting." When Vale returned to the Merritt house, it was unlocked. The front door hung open, and the porch light buzzed weakly, swinging on its chain. Inside, the air was colder than outside, the kind of cold that didn't belong to weather. The kitchen table was set for 4, plates untouched, a meal still waiting for a family that wasn't there. The clock above the sink read 2:14, the same frozen minute that had haunted them since the blackout. Vale moved room to room calling names, but only the echo answered back. Lila's bed was stripped, the mattress bare except for the outline of her body faintly pressed into the fabric. On the wall above it, the cracked mirror was missing, replaced by a square of unpainted wood that looked older than the rest of the room. He crouched and found the reel-to-reel still spinning, though the tape had long finished. The machine clicked endlessly, feeding an invisible loop of nothing. When he touched it, the hum returned, not through speakers, but through the floorboards. It was deep, bone-level, patient. The house was empty, but it wasn't abandoned. It felt occupied. Vale whispered her name once, softly. Lila? Every light in the house flickered on. In the same breath, the hum deepened until it was no longer sound, but feeling. And in the glow of the living room lamp, he saw something impossible. The shadow of a girl on the wall, her hair hanging over her face, swaying slightly, though there was no one there to cast it. By morning, Whitlo looked like a town recovering from fever. Windows were open, though it was freezing. Radios lay disassembled on porches, wires dangling like veins. People whispered that the noise had moved indoors, that you could hear it in pipes, in power lines, even in the space between your own heartbeat. The pastor's wife claimed her rosary beads vibrated during prayer. At the gas station, the attendant's watch ticked twice for every second. Vale moved through it like a ghost, taking notes that didn't matter anymore. The sheriff was gone, so was half the congregation. Those who stayed behind spoke in half sentences, distracted by sounds no one else could verify. "It's in the windmill," one man said. "It's under the grain elevator," said another. Vale knew they were all right. The signal wasn't local anymore. It had infected the landscape, threading itself through wires, roots, and iron until the town itself had become a transmitter. At noon, the church bell rang 12 times, though the rope had been cut since 1958. The noise was deep and wet, like metal groaning underwater. Every bird in Whitlo rose into the air and circled above Main Street before flying due west. No one followed. The air was too thick with soundless vibration. Vale found the pastor kneeling outside the church, his hands covering his ears. "She's dreaming again," he said. Vale looked toward the horizon, where the wheat bent without wind. "No," he whispered, voice trembling. "She's not dreaming. We are." That night, every television in the Midwest flickered on at once. No images appeared, only static, but a voice spoke beneath it, soft, patient, human. Most people couldn't make out the words, but those who listened closely claimed it was speaking to them personally, saying their names. In Kansas City, an anchorman tried to read the weather when his teleprompter began typing messages on its own. "Do you hear me?" He laughed it off, right until his microphone began repeating the phrase, distorted over and over. Vale recorded as much as he could from a small transistor set, his hand shaking so violently the dial kept slipping. The voice repeated in endless rhythm, always calm, always kind. It didn't threaten, it invited. "Listen," it said, "listen and remember." The power grid dimmed from Chicago to Dallas, flickering like a pulse. Those who stayed awake said they felt lighter, as if gravity had forgotten them. Vale dropped the radio and fell to his knees. He'd heard that voice before, on tape, in the Merritt bedroom. It wasn't Lila's voice. It was older, slower, like something using her tone to rehearse speech. "Why us?" he whispered to the air. The reply came through every radio in Whitlo at once. "Because you were listening." Then, as suddenly as it had come, the static went quiet, leaving behind only the echo of his own breathing. By dawn, Vale's maps of the Midwest were covered in red pins, places where the signal had been detected, forming a pattern across 5 states. When viewed from above, it traced a perfect spiral, converging on Whitlo. "It's coming home," he muttered, but something in the spacing unsettled him. Each point wasn't random. They matched population centers, as though the signal was using human consciousness itself as relay towers. People began collapsing in their homes, not dead, not asleep, just still, eyes half open, breathing shallow. Doctors in neighboring towns called it collective catatonia. Vale recognized the EEG pattern immediately. It was Lila's, repeated hundreds of times. Every sleeping body was a mirror of hers. The hum now played faintly through every hospital intercom, every police radio, every phone left off the hook. The world had become an amplifier. He circled the last pin, Whitlo, and stared at it for a long time. Then he realized something horrifying. The spiral wasn't closing in. It was expanding outward. Every night, another ring appeared on the map, growing larger, fainter, until the entire United States began to look like one endless sound wave. And at the center of it, where the first hum began, Laya Merritt slept beneath an empty sky, her pulse synced to the heartbeat of a planet that had learned to dream back. By the end of the week, the world had divided itself into two kinds of people, those who could hear the hum and those who could not. In Whitlo, Vale watched the news from a half-working television whose picture rolled endlessly upward like the signal itself was trying to climb free. Across the ticker crawled stories too synchronized to be coincidence. Monasteries reporting monks falling into deep, simultaneous sleep. Ship radios transmitting ghost frequencies even with power off. An entire choir in Oregon freezing mid-hymn on the word Amen. Scientists from Chicago to Berlin called it a global auditory anomaly. The Vatican called it an awakening. Vale called it confirmation. He hadn't eaten in days, and the sound had nested in the base of his skull like tinnitus with intention. When he closed his eyes, he saw flickers of color that didn't exist on the visible spectrum, shades that seemed to hum on their own. He wasn't losing his mind, he was tuning in. The frequency wasn't spreading at random, it was being received. People weren't infected, they were antennas. Lila hadn't brought something into the world. She had simply noticed it first. "She didn't open a door," Vale said into his recorder, voice unsteady. "She just stopped pretending it was closed." On the third night of December, the hum became visible. It began as tremors in city lights, street lamps flickering in exact intervals, power grids dimming with the steadiness of a heartbeat. In Tokyo, subway trains stopped for 3 seconds at the same time as the traffic lights in London. In Cairo, radio towers vibrated audibly without wind. The world wasn't breaking, it was synchronizing. Vale marked the timing from Whitlo. Exactly 2:14 a.m., the same number again. He realized then that the hum was not a broadcast, but a countdown, and that whatever it signaled was nearing completion. Every television in town turned itself on, screens glowing blank and white, pulsing gently like breath. People stood in front of them, hypnotized, as though the world had collectively forgotten motion. Vale tried to shout, to pull one man away from his screen, but when he touched him, the man blinked and whispered Lila's name. That's when Vale noticed the reflection in the glass, not his own, not the man's, but a familiar outline with closed eyes and a calm, endless smile. Laya Merritt, or whatever now wore her likeness, was staring through the static. Her lips moved once, slow and deliberate. He couldn't hear the words, but somehow he knew what they meant. "It's almost here." Vale barricaded himself inside the schoolhouse on the edge of town, the last place without working electricity. He set up his portable generator and wired it to the recorder, running a copper coil into the ground like a homemade antenna. The hum was there immediately, faint but constant. This time, he didn't record. He listened. Beneath the steady tone was structure, not chaos, not random interference, but layered cadence, rhythm, repetition, emphasis. It was speech, not in English or in any human language, but in the shape of thought itself. Ideas transmitted as vibration. He began to transcribe by instinct, writing faster than he could think, lines that looked less like words and more like equations for music. When he finished, the paper read only 3 distinct symbols repeated over and over. Therefore, therefore, therefore. He recognized it from Lila's EEG readouts. Not letters, not code. A pattern meaning therefore, because, therefore, a logical loop. The hum wasn't trying to communicate, it was trying to synchronize reasoning. Vale realized, horrified, that intelligence wasn't being shared. It was being averaged. Every living mind on Earth was being tuned toward one single, mean frequency. Humanity was becoming harmonic. And harmony, he understood, was only peaceful to those who survived the tuning. December 14th, 2:14 a.m. The world paused. Airplanes drifted without engines. Clocks stopped mid-tick. Every recording device on Earth captured the same thing. A single low note that lasted exactly 7 seconds, then cut to silence. Vale, standing outside the schoolhouse, felt it before he heard it. The ground shivered like an animal trying to shake off sleep. The stars above seemed to blur, as if their light had to pass through something newly awake. Across the plains, faint lights began appearing in the distance, not fire, not electricity, but something softer, alive. He walked toward one and found it hovering a foot above the ground, humming with the same rhythm as Lila's pulse had years ago. Inside it, for the briefest instant, he saw her, or what was left of her, suspended in light, eyes open, smiling faintly. "You made contact," he whispered. "No," she said, her voice like static forming a shape. "It made you." The light blinked once and vanished, leaving behind only the hum, louder now, woven through the soil, through the sky, through the bones of the earth itself. Vale fell to his knees, clutching his head as the vibration moved through him, rearranging thought into something that no longer felt singular. The next morning, the world woke into quiet. Radios were dead, satellites offline, clocks blinking 2:14 in every time zone. The hum was gone. People wandered streets like survivors after a storm, unsure of what they'd survived. Some claimed to have seen light. Others remembered nothing. In Whitlo, the Merritt house was gone, not collapsed, not burned, just gone. Only its foundation remained, and at its center, a shallow crater filled with perfectly still water. Vale's equipment was found miles away, melted into black glass. The last tape in his recorder had fused to the reel, but fragments could still be heard, breathing, static, and his voice whispering a single phrase. "We weren't chosen. We were tuned, then silence. No birds, no engines, just the faint echo of something vast and mechanical, turning far above the clouds, like the world itself resetting its frequency. And in that silence, for one impossible moment, every person who had ever dreamed of Laya Merritt heard the same thing. A gentle breath, followed by the whisper of a girl saying, "Wake up." The world did, but it was not the same one that had fallen asleep. No one could say exactly when the hum stopped, because no one remembered when it began again. Weeks after what journalists later called the 214 event, the world had become unnaturally calm. Planes stayed grounded. Oceans lay flat as glass. Even storms moved in precise circles, as if obeying a tempo only they could hear. In Whitlo, what was left of it, grass grew in perfect spirals across the empty fields. People walked slower, spoke softer. There was no panic, no riots, just alignment. News broadcasts resumed, but every anchor spoke in the same cadence, pausing on the same syllables. Their eyes didn't blink often enough. The language itself had softened, rounded. Words like I and mine had quietly vanished from headlines. Vale's journals were found inside an old storm shelter 2 miles west of the Merritt property. The last entries were erratic, scrawled by an unsteady hand. It's using us as mirror, not possession, reflection. Every thought echoed back cleaner, calmer, less human. One line at the bottom read simply, "She's still dreaming and the world is learning how." No one knew what he meant. Then one morning, every reflective surface on Earth, windows, lakes, chrome, glass, shimmered faintly for exactly 7 seconds. When it faded, people claimed to have seen faces not their own, smiling faintly, lips moving in sync. The phrase they formed was the same everywhere. "Do you hear me now?" Months passed. Electricity returned, but not the same kind. Devices powered on without cords, lights burned cooler, gentler, as if the air itself had learned to conduct. Children were born who never cried, only hummed softly when frightened. Doctors called it benign neurological mimicry. The churches filled again, though no one prayed aloud. Faith had turned inward. In Kansas City, a researcher noticed that the Earth's magnetic field had stabilized for the first time in recorded history. No storms, no flares, perfect symmetry. But people no longer dreamed the way they used to. Sleep had become communal. Families described waking with shared memories, the same visions, the same sentences half remembered in languages they'd never learned. When psychologists interviewed them, the answers were identical. We were standing in the field, the Merritt field, and someone was counting. They asked who. The participants smiled in unison, the one who listened first. Scientists dismissed it as mass psychosis, but one night, a radio station in Denver, silent since the blackout, began transmitting again. No music, no speech, just a heartbeat, slow and steady, repeating forever. The world called it interference. Vale would have called it proof. Under the cracked soil of Whitlo, something pulsed. Miners in Oklahoma reported vibrations that registered like seismic murmurs but carried harmonic signatures. Literal notes, resonant frequencies arranged in repeating intervals. Geologists charted them like tremors, but the data drew a perfect waveform centered on the missing Merritt house. Satellite images showed a faint ring of green around the site, grass glowing under starlight, bending in rhythm with the unheard hum. Governments quarantined the area, citing radiation. They built fences, posted guards, and called it safe. But at night, the guards stopped reporting. Cameras aimed at the crater went dark at 2:14 a.m. sharp every night. When footage resumed, faint impressions in the soil appeared, outlines of hands pressed upward from beneath, dozens of them. Each morning, new ones, some smaller, some impossibly large. Scientists analyzed the soundless footage, counting over 100 distinct impressions, each spaced exactly 1 heartbeat apart. In the command tent nearby, a technician monitoring the seismic readout swore she heard whispering under the static. She slowed the feed and listened again. Beneath the low-frequency waves layered between the noise, a child's voice spoke clearly, "I'm still here." Then in the background, a second voice answered softly, "So are we." The following spring, something strange began happening to language. Words that once divided meaning began blending. People started using plural forms where singular ones should be. We think, we remember, we saw. Linguists blamed online mimicry. Neurologists blamed trauma. But those who lived near Whitlo knew the truth. They heard it in the wind. The same subtle pulse that once filled radios now threaded through conversation, a cadence of shared understanding that required no translation. The human voice had changed. It carried undertones that made air tremble faintly, harmonics impossible for a single throat. In schools, children answered questions before teachers asked them. In cities, strangers paused mid-step, smiling as if reminded of a private joke they'd never told aloud. Dreams began leaking into waking life, thin and translucent as breath on glass. And sometimes, in those quiet hours before dawn, when the world tilted between sleep and awareness, people swore they could hear something immense breathing just beneath the surface of sound, the low, patient exhale of a planet humming back. Not angry, not divine, just awake. Years later, the Merritt site was declared a memorial. No one remembered the family clearly, only the story of the girl who dreamed the world into silence. The crater had filled with water smooth as a mirror, ringed by reeds that swayed without wind. Pilgrims came and sat beside it for hours, listening to the faint hum that never truly left. Some said it cured their tinnitus. Others said it whispered their names. And if you stood there long enough, you could almost make out the echo of two voices, layered perfectly, one human, one not, speaking in tandem. "We hear you," they said. "Do you hear us?" On windless nights, the water shimmered faintly, as if remembering itself. The stars above flickered once, twice, like eyelids adjusting to light. And somewhere between the silence and the sound, the world took one long, steady breath and answered back. The hum resumed, soft and infinite, threading through every wire, every thought, every heartbeat. Not as warning, not as curse, but as reminder that once, long ago, a girl closed her eyes and the universe finally listened.